I don't have to tell you that Romantasy has absolutely exploded in the last couple years, breaking records, top of the bestseller lists, and flooding both book talk and real-life bookstore shelves. And while Romantasy certainly gets its fair share of criticism, I would say that the fans are pretty feral in defending it, highlighting that it is a female-centric niche written by women for women, that it centers powerful heroines claiming their desire, and that those criticizing the genre are simply the latest in a long line gathering together to diminish and make light of women's interests and hobbies, and are participating in thinly veiled misogyny. And yet, it feels hard to ignore that in the most popular books in this subgenre, cis-het men are still dominating, physically, sexually, socially, politically, with very little variation on a narrow theme. So I just have to ask, whose power fantasy is this? Exactly. There's this mindset that's become really popular lately online that is basically saying, if you don't like it, it's not for you. Move on, focus on something else. No one needs to hear you bringing negativity into a space for people who are enjoying a thing. And honestly, for the most part, fair. Not every piece of art has to appeal to every person. Not every piece of art should appeal to every person. That just waters down what the art is and what it's able to achieve. And bad faith criticism absolutely exists and proliferates on the internet. It's everywhere you look in massive quantities. But I do think there is a difference between protecting art and media from bad faith criticism and shutting down all thoughtful analysis altogether. Criticism is not the opposite of respect. And I think if we want genres like Romantasy and romance more broadly to be taken more seriously, not just guilty pleasure books or silly fluff or fairy smut, then we have to be willing to actually look at these books through an analytical lens and allow other people to do so too. And just because a genre is primarily marketed to women does not make it automatically progressive, feminist, or liberatory. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do think we have to define what romantasy means. No two people seem to agree, so these are just the definitions I'm going to use. Romantasy is romance first. It's structurally a romance novel, following many of the same tropes and conventions as a traditional romance, but set in a fantasy world. The fantasy elements heighten the stakes, but the central arc is the romantic relationship. Fantasy romance is more of an even split. The romance is prominent, but the world building and the larger fantasy plot carry equal weight. Then you have romantic fantasy, or fantasy with a romance subplot, and these are fantasy forward. So the plot, the world building, the magic system, the politics, the themes, these are all the focus of the novel, and the romance is secondary. And I think up until the last 5 years or so, we would have just called this fantasy and left it at that. A lot of fantasy for many decades has had romance in it in some way, shape, or form. I do find it interesting that in this particular subgenre, there seems to be a lot of gatekeeping about what counts as romantasy and what doesn't. Not only does no one seem to agree on what makes a book romantasy, but it also feels like as soon as a book does anything slightly different, whether it pulls in a different trope, has queer representation in its protagonists, more racial diversity, or inspired by a different culture than the standard run-of-the-mill romantasy, just ignores or subverts certain relationship dynamics, those books often seem to be pushed out of the romantasy box. They have their romantasy label revoked and are given a different label, even if they are romance first. It just makes me think about which tropes and relationship dynamics are so central and vital to the definition of this genre that taking a step outside the box in any direction gets you excluded from it altogether, and what that says about the genre as a whole. I'm going to toss up on the screen the romantasy novels that I have read for context. Something I started to notice very quickly when I got into reading romantasy is tropes that seem relatively minor on their own, but as you add them up, they start to really paint a picture. A huge height gap here, an age gap of over a century over there, inexperienced protagonist paired with a much more sexually seasoned love interest, a mate bond of some kind that seems to override the choices of our individual characters, kink-coded dynamics with little to no explicit communication or negotiation. Individually, none of these are inherently problematic. A height gap is not a moral failing, an age gap can be totally fine. Kink and BDSM can be healthy and consensual, fated mates can be very romantic and dramatic, and even enemies to lovers kind of dynamic can have some fun spice to it and be entertaining to watch two characters who think they hate each other but actually in fact are obsessed with each other and both too proud to say it. But when the same tropes cluster together again and again and again, especially in the most commercially successful and dominant books, and when books that don't include one or many of these tropes get pushed out of the subgenre altogether, it's like they become requirements to entry to the genre rather than a particular flavor of a genre, one amongst many options for the kinds of dynamics that an author could choose from to approach their story and their characters. Dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of best-selling books essentially writing the exact same relationship in different fonts is a very clear pattern. These tiny details that we've almost stopped noticing because they are so ubiquitous aren't pointless or unworthy of examination. They are the canaries in the coal mine. These are the indicators of the larger narrative that Romantasy is pushing on its audience, whether intentional or not. And I think that becomes especially obvious when we notice the lack of diversity in the most popular Romantasy titles. Somehow, in many of these worlds that are complete fantasy with mythical creatures and magic and made-up religions, gods are real and walk the earth, we have not a single gender nonconforming or queer person or person of color to be seen anywhere, except maybe as a tertiary character that gets 2 lines and then is never spoken to again. There are exceptions, but honestly, my main concern here is that the books that do tend to have this representation are the books that are most often pushed out of Romantasy and assigned a different label. Why are the most popular books and the ones recommended time and time again lacking in any meaningful representation or diversity? Why are stories that highlight trans protagonists or non-binary protagonists or asexual protagonists not allowed to be Romantasy? Why are they labeled as fantasy romance or romantic fantasy? I think the most popular books in Romantasy have an issue with tokenism, and I think that a large proportion of the audience of Romantasy has an issue with, whether again intentionally or not, dismissing diverse stories as niche stories, stories that should be kept on the sidelines, and not books that are for general consumption and enjoyment. I also think it's worth mentioning here that Romantasy is supposed to be romance first, but in practice, mainstream Romantasy very much assumes that romance naturally culminates in explicit sex. It ignores and erases asexuality from the conversation and asexual people from the narrative, and I am mostly focusing on the sexual dynamics of the relationships in these books in this video, but I do want to make that point that there is a real lack of, at least as far as I've seen, books that are allowed to be Romantasy that are not necessarily spicy, that can focus on the romance and make the romance prominent in the story without having explicit sex on the page. And there are, of course, even more intersections here with race, class, and disability. There are a lot more conversations to be had on this topic. I want to take a moment to really zoom in on the sexual dynamics of the most popular Romantasy books that are out there, even when the female main character is presented as being bold and stubborn, independent. The sexual momentum is often driven entirely by the male lead. He pushes her, he corners her, he commands her, he senses what she wants and needs before she can even become aware of those wants and needs herself, let alone consciously articulate them. And the result is this kind of illusion of agency. She chooses him, yeah, eventually. She desires him, sure, I guess, but the structure of their interactions still follows a very traditional framework. Male pursuit and dominance to a female responsiveness and surrender. And what makes this particularly striking to me as a reader is how often the sexual dynamic contradicts the general characterization outside the bedroom. A heroine who can overthrow a regime by lunch suddenly becomes sexually submissive. A woman who can outwit generals twice her age suddenly becomes completely incapable of articulating her wants, needs, boundaries, and desires. If we're constantly told that real masculinity is possessive, controlling, instinctively dominant, then anything that centers a woman's independent pleasure can start to look threatening. A man who is confident in himself and genuinely excited about his partner's pleasure is infinitely sexier than a man who is trying to cover up insecurity with a mask of control. But you can't convince me that some of these 7-foot-tall fey males who run around screaming about their fated mate wouldn't be emasculated at the thought of their partner getting off on her own from time to time while they're away at war. Just saying. And if we're going to be talking about empowerment and desire, we should also talk about the orgasm gap. And that's why I want to highlight something that actually supports pleasure for people of all genders and sexualities, the sponsor of this video, Bellesa. Bellesa is a by-women company for all things sexual wellness, and their mission is to encourage everyone to embrace, explore, and celebrate their sexuality. And that's why my friends at Bellesa and I are literally sending out free toys or gift cards for toys to everyone who signs up to my giveaway with the link in my description. Let's talk about some of their spicy adult toys that your favorite shadow daddy would not want his protagonist to have on hand, because he would have some serious competition. You've probably seen this toy go viral all over the internet, the Rose toy from Bellesa. This absolutely adorable and very travel-friendly toy is TSA approved, made from 100% body-safe silicone and splash-proof, though not 100% submersible. USB rechargeable with 10 different suction modes, this little flower-shaped toy is iconic. There's also their famous Air Vibe, which is almost entirely silent, but extremely powerful. And if only we could say the same about shadow daddies, who are maybe powerful, but very infrequently silent. Why do they never stop talking? The Air Vibe provides dual stimulation, all while being waterproof and rechargeable. Then there's the Thump, a toy that does it all. Vibrates, suctions, and thumps, designed to be an all-in-one replacement for external vibes, and utilizing Bellesa's improved Pleasure Jet technology, waterproof and rechargeable, and is made from premium quality silicone. Some of the best things about Bellesa's toys are that they're designed ergonomically to fit really comfortably in your hand in a way that makes sense. They're also very discreet and elegant. Many of their toys come with sleek storage cases that fit effortlessly in your life and don't give anything away. Don't forget that Bellesa is giving away free toys or gift cards for toys to everyone who enters the giveaway in my description, so make sure to enter to get your free toy or gift card for a toy from Bellesa and embrace and celebrate your own pleasure. Who needs a shadow daddy when you have Bellesa? One thing that I find a little strange about Romantasy as a genre, especially when it is framed as fiction by women for women that is focused on women's sexual liberation. Why, if that's the case, are so few of these explicit sex scenes on the page actually focused on women's pleasure? We have very little communication around consent. If it seems like it's included at all, it is typically implied, not actually explicitly stated. The vast majority of the time, boundaries are being assumed, not actually discussed and established. Safety and aftercare are rarely on the page unless the plot absolutely demands it. Foreplay is often rushed or totally absent. And the female orgasm, while it tends to be written to happen every time, is frequently framed as an automatic byproduct of penetration by the most magical shadow daddy member to exist, rather than something that's been intentionally cultivated that might require a variety of different tools in your tool belt, including possibly a toy, if they exist in this fantasy world. At least anecdotally, as far as I can tell from existing on the internet, the vast majority of women are not capable of reaching orgasm simply through penetration and no other stimulation, at least not on a regular basis, but that is often how these scenes are written. And I think that not only is decentering women's pleasure, but it's also normalizing an expectation that women should be able to orgasm simply from penetration and nothing else. And that can really cause a lot of distress. They think they should be able to do that and they can't, and they think that means there's something wrong with them. And that to me is a flaw in the system, especially if we're saying that these books are written by women for women about women's pleasure. Where's the foreplay? Where's the external stimulation? Where's the communication? Whose needs are we serving by reinforcing the idea that people on the receiving end of penetration should and will reach orgasm every time from penetration alone? And who are we shafting, pun entirely intended, by normalizing, even in erotic fiction written by and for women, the idea that women don't need any other attention or stimulation to get off? When the most commercially dominant books consistently portray women's pleasure in these cis-het pairings as something that happens because the male lead is powerful and instinctively dominant, rather than because the partners who are equal partners are collaborating and communicating to find mutual pleasure, that says something about how sexual dynamics are being framed. in the genre as a whole. It begins to feel like it's suggesting that sexual pleasure comes from being overtaken, conquered, rather than from being understood. And I just find that fascinating because we know and have known for a long time that women's pleasure outside of fiction requires communication and intentionality and attention, listening, adjusting, respect. The orgasm gap will not be solved by intensity alone. It's solved by listening, patience, and mutual effort. So why, in these stories marketed as female fantasies, do we so rarely see these dynamics modeled? Why does male dominance and intensity and passion get narrative focus, while attentiveness and consistency are glossed over if they're included at all? Who benefits from perpetuating this narrative and normalizing it? And in trying to work through my feelings on this topic and writing them out, I kept coming back to the concept coined by Laura Mulvey in 1975 of the male gaze. And I know the male gaze has become such a overused, often misused concept and term to the point where it's almost lost all meaning, but I do think it still is a useful framework for certain discussions, and it just kept popping back into my head. Mulvey said, "In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female." And you might say, Elizabeth, how is the male gaze relevant here? These are largely books written by women for women. How is this not the female gaze? And I'd just like to point out that the male gaze doesn't just come from men. Women can internalize the male gaze. And even in books written by women for women, we can still pick up on a quality to the writing where the romantic and sexual dynamics are reflecting this internalized version of the male gaze, where the female characters are performing a very specific kind of femininity that appeals to the male gaze, to male preferences, where the sexual and romantic dynamics are structured around male preferences and male dominance, and a more male active role and a female reactive role. And that is because the male gaze became so prolific, so ubiquitous in media that women were consuming from as young as they could consume media, that by the time women are creating their own media, they have thoroughly internalized these frameworks and perspectives and ideas. Now, to clear up two things, the first thing is that while women can internalize both misogyny and the male gaze, that doesn't mean that women are incapable of having agency and of writing stories free from the male gaze, from patriarchy, or from misogyny. But it does take a certain amount of unpacking the messages that we've had shoved in our faces for our entire lives to be able to get to a more neutral place underneath all of the layers of conditioning. The second thing is that these dynamics can be genuine fantasies for people and for readers, and I'm not knocking that or saying there's anything wrong with that on its face. I think for a lot of women, dominance in a male partner can be a turn on. It can feel intense and therefore passionate. It can feel safe, like a protector dynamic. Being overwhelmed romantically or sexually can feel almost intoxicating to some people. I think relinquishing control, especially in a sexual situation with ideally boundaries and communication and safety, can feel like a relief, especially if you are working a really intense job, if you're making big decisions day to day and you want to be able to turn your brain off and be more passive in one part of your life. I think for a lot of people, the idea of being passive or submissive sexually is a way to take a back seat when they are in the driver's seat for a lot of their life. And I think that can apply not just to readers who maybe have big important jobs or have a lot of responsibilities in their day-to-day life and want to read as a way to unwind and disconnect and take that step back, but also for the characters. Because if you are a female character who's tearing down the government and leading a revolution and making life or death decisions, maybe you don't want to be the one deciding which positions you're going to do the deed in with your partner. You just want to go along for the ride and turn your brain off a little bit. That being said, if one book or a few books or several books explore that dynamic, that would be one thing. That would be a collection of books that are exploring this particular dynamic and serving that need or fulfilling that fantasy. When every single book is portraying the dynamic in the exact same way, without interrogating it, without getting into the psychological reasons for why these characters might want this dynamic, without them ever talking about it, without offering literally any alternatives anywhere ever, and without showing the characters negotiating and coming to terms with the dynamic, actually figuring out how they're compatible and how they can accommodate each other's needs. It starts to feel less like a niche fantasy or maybe even a majority fantasy, but one fantasy among many, and more like the default or the template, the natural order of the world and the natural order of sexual dynamics, and how, especially within these very cis het normative dynamics, how a cis straight man and a cis straight woman should and will interact sexually or romantically. And I'm sure I will get comments, because they always come up in these discussions, that fantasies do not equal real life, that we can fantasize about things in fiction, enjoy reading about things in fiction that we don't want in real life, that we wouldn't enjoy in real life. And that can be true, certainly, but I do think there is more of a link between fantasies and the real world than we sometimes like to acknowledge. And there's a really useful framework to have this discussion that I came across in my research called sexual script theory. Sexual script theory is a sociological framework that explains how our expectations about sex and romantic interactions are not purely biological or instinctual, but are shaped by learned cultural narratives and social norms. According to this theory, the scripts people follow in sexual situations are like unwritten rules that tell us how to behave, what roles to play, and what outcomes are considered desirable, much like actors following a script in a play. These scripts are learned through culture, media, and interpersonal experience, and influence not only what we do in intimate situations, but what we expect from them. This framework helps to explain why repeated patterns in media, such as those found in Romantasy, can shape how people think about romance, sexuality, desire, initiation, and intimacy in real life. Sexual script theory tells us that repeated narratives shape expectations about how intimacy is supposed to unfold, not in a direct causal way, but in a normative one. Sexual script theory talks about the normalization of certain patterns of behavior, of certain scripts of how a sexual encounter can progress from beginning to end, that really inform how we engage in sexual situations in our own lives. Over time, these templates influence people's expectations and preferences in a way that can feel very natural, but is actually culturally constructed and imposed upon us externally. If the dominant script that we're getting from all directions, or that we're getting repeatedly through whatever media we choose to consume, is telling us that desire is instinctive, wordless, driven by the male partner and their desires and their certainty in a situation, then explicit communication and mutual desire and negotiation can start to feel less sexy, both in fiction and in real life. I've seen many women online and in person express the feeling that a man explicitly asking for permission or consent to do things sexually or romantically with them is unsexy, that it turns them off, that it's not manly enough. Even if this is the first time you're interacting with this person in a romantic or sexual way and you haven't set your boundaries yet. And I've also seen posts online, and I've heard it in person before, that overconsumption of romantasy can lead to dissatisfaction in real life romantic and sexual relationships. And while sure, sometimes that could be an incompatibility issue, maybe their needs aren't being met, it's also possible that the expectations being shaped by this highly stylized and tropified fantasy fiction is unrealistic in real life. You are very unlikely to have a safe and satisfying sexual encounter, especially with a stranger, especially if it involves any kind of kink or power dynamics or BDSM, without clear communication, setting boundaries, negotiating, and mutual understanding and respect. And that part isn't always framed as sexy in fiction. It's often not included at all, but it's part of real life safety and real life satisfaction. I've also seen examples of people who are feeling unsatisfied with the size gap in their relationship in real life. They want to be picked up and tossed around like they are as light as a feather. Height gaps and size gaps in hetero romances in the fiction I read is one of my biggest pet peeves, especially because as time goes on, these asymmetries are getting so ridiculous to almost feel satirical, and yet everyone is taking it seriously. I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if anyone else has seen how ridiculous things are getting, and everyone everyone else is just fine with it. And whether you want to contend with that or not, and however you personally feel about size gaps, height gaps, whether you're personally into it or not, it's just a fact that these dynamics reinforce very traditional gendered expectations of size. We expect men to be 7 feet tall and so jacked they can't fit through a door unless they turn sideways. And we expect women to be so teeny tiny you can't even see them with a microscope. That is maybe not an uncommon fantasy for people to have. I think it's worth asking where that fantasy comes from, what the root of that desire is, and whether it is really an intrinsic desire or something that's been imposed upon you externally from social conditioning, and what it says about how we gender things like size and strength, but also expecting your partner, who let's just say is the average height of a man on planet Earth, 5'7", who probably also has a full-time job and limited time for combat training or weightlifting in general, to embody that exaggerated physical ideal might not be realistic, especially if you are the average height of a woman on the planet, 5'3", because a 4-inch difference is pretty far off from the well over a foot height difference that is often depicted in Romantasy. If physical size and strength is genuinely important to you in your partner, that's your prerogative. You are free to seek out and find someone you're compatible with who is of the size that you are looking for. But I do think it's worth questioning why one physical trait or two physical traits should outweigh so many others, including compatibility, communication, attentiveness, respect, or whether your pleasure is being actively prioritized. If someone can physically overpower you but doesn't care if you orgasm, is that really the pinnacle of sexual compatibility? Everyone is allowed to fantasize. Everyone is allowed to enjoy more exaggerated dynamics in fiction. But I think there's a difference between enjoying a fantasy and shifting your expectations of real life intimacy in ways that don't serve you and also might not be actually possible. And while yes, there is that refrain that fantasy is fantasy and doesn't impact what people want in real life, the sexual script theory and the researchers who are studying it are finding a connection between the media we consume and the sexual scripts we follow in our real lives. And I think that's worth considering when we're looking at Romantasy as a genre and the types of sexual dynamics and expectations it's reinforcing. Traditional epic fantasy of yore has often been described as a male power fantasy. The farm boy becomes the chosen one. The weak become strong. The underestimated become rulers or heroes. Power in these stories often accumulates around the very normal everyman protagonist. So if Romantasy is written predominantly by and for women, why isn't it a woman's power fantasy in the same way? Why, even in worlds that we invent entirely from scratch, do men end up holding most of the power? Even when a woman becomes politically or socially powerful within one of these stories, she's often ascending to power within an existing structure or system without dismantling it. The oppressed peasant becomes a queen because she marries the king. The brutalized victim becomes an assassin because she gets mentored by a male assassin or taken under the wing of a prince. The system stays intact. She just rises to new heights within it and is often the sole woman to do so. Some people might consider this neoliberal feminism, where empowerment means individual women rising within existing hierarchies rather than transforming the hierarchy itself and lifting women as a whole. And especially often white women gaining privilege or power while women of color are left behind. And again, in a lot of the popular Romantasy, within the actual intimate relationship, within the romantic or sexual dynamic, the structure rarely shifts away from male dominance. If this is supposed to be a space, a genre, a narrative which allows women to imagine different structures, different systems, different rules, then why do intimate power structures so often look painfully familiar? Can we truly not imagine a world where sexuality and desire aren't centered on male dominance? Can we really not imagine a heroine who is sexually directive, who initiates, who is physically dominant, who holds relational power without it being framed as villainous or emasculating? Why are we so comfortable overthrowing tyrants in the political sphere, but not in the bedroom? And maybe the answer is as simple as all the writers of these books, all the readers of these books are shaped by the world we live in. Maybe our fantasies are built from familiar frameworks because it's hard to imagine any other way than what we've always known. Maybe safety, even in fiction, feels like it has to be tied to these familiar, recognizable hierarchies. Maybe it's hard to imagine women truly being in a position of independence and power. Or maybe it's market pressure. Maybe certain dynamics and tropes sell better. Maybe the shadow daddy archetype is commercially viable, marketable, reliable in a way that radically reimagining intimacy is not. But if traditional epic fantasy for many, many decades has allowed men to imagine themselves as powerful, world-changing central figures, shouldn't Romantasy allow women not only to imagine themselves as magically powerful, but relationally and sexually powerful too? Instead, we often get a heroine who is exceptional and powerful and a leader in every arena except the one that matters most to her intimate relationships. Romantasy loves to market itself as empowering, as woman-focused, as women getting what they want. But if what we want as women is still being framed as being protected, possessed, overpowered, then whose power fantasy are we really reinforcing? Are we escaping the patriarchy, or are we just aestheticizing it in leather pants with wings? I do think it's worth examining because it can reveal how deeply our imagination and our fantasies are shaped by the very systems we think we're transcending. And last but not least, I want to touch on romantasy, purity culture, and conservative comfort. Gender essentialism is the belief that men and women have fixed, innate traits that define who they are and how they behave. Examples would be women are naturally nurturing, men are naturally dominant. Gender essentialism is about assigning fixed personality traits, behaviors, and social roles to genders and treating them as natural and universal. Bioessentialism grounds gender essentialism in biology, and it says that traits and roles are not just culturally typical, they are biologically inevitable. Gender essentialism and bioessentialism are harmful to people in general, I would say, but of course deeply exclusionary to trans people, to non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, basically anyone who doesn't fit the perceived prescribed gender norms are left out of the conversation and harmed by these very strict viewpoints on the world and gender and sex. Simone de Beauvoir famously wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." In other words, womanhood, femininity, is socially constructed, not biologically inevitable. So when Romantasy repeatedly codes femininity as smallness, vulnerability, fertility, or sexual passivity as natural feminine traits, it's worth asking whether we're watching social conditioning in action. And again, none of these traits are inherently bad. The issue is how consistently and repeatedly and exclusively they appear. In the most popular romantasy, there's often very little room for nonconformity, very little exploration of fluidity. Trans people are rarely centered, if included at all. Queer people are usually relegated to secondary or tertiary characters that pop up from time to time. Same with characters of color, unless we're talking about male love interests who are tall, dark, and handsome, but described in such an ambiguous way as to allow certain readers to imagine them as white if they so prefer, which they then proceed to do. In many of these books that end in pregnancy of some kind, feminine worth is tied to fertility and pregnancy and reproduction, which sidelines trans people and cis people who are dealing with infertility or might not want to have children for literally any reason. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with wanting children, characters starting a family, but when a genre repeatedly frames reproduction as the natural culmination of love and power, it starts to feel like it's echoing something much older and more conservative. Most fantasy in general, not just romantasy, but fantasy on a larger scale, even speculative fiction on a larger scale, including things like sci-fi, love to condemn oppressive regimes, tyrannical governments, corrupt institutions and monarchies, inequality baked into our systems. They love to tear them down. And yet, in romantasy, while the political world might still be revolutionary or progressive, the intimate and relational structures still remain deeply traditional. The monarchy might fall, but the cis heteronormative interpersonal hierarchy in your intimate relationships will still stand for all time. Don't you worry. And queer romance in romantasy often interrogates power in a very different way, which just makes the mainstream cis heteronormative romantasy template stand out even more starkly. And I would be remiss to go this whole video without talking about the capitalism of it all. Can I make a video without shitting on capitalism? No, I cannot. Romantasy is massively commercially successful. It is marketed extremely broadly, and when something reaches that level of mainstream visibility, there is a pressure on authors from publishers to make it as palatable as possible to the widest possible audience. You want to sell to everyone, as many demographics as you can, so you make the most amount of money you can. Market saturation. That includes readers who are conservative, readers who are religious, readers who might not want overtly progressive representations of gender, sexuality, relationship dynamics in the books they read. And I'm not saying that authors and publishers are sitting down having a meeting about how they can write conservative propaganda into their romantasy, but I do think it's fair to ask whether certain dynamics are reinforced because they are comfortable, familiar, non-threatening to the status quo. A fantasy where the heroine is powerful in certain realms but is still ultimately protected by a dominant man is less disruptive to someone reading who has more traditional values than a fantasy where gender roles are completely dismantled. And a story where sexual narratives are framed as something that happens to the heroine rather than something she actively initiates or chooses is easier to reconcile with a purity culture narrative. For more conservative readers who are shaped by religious upbringings and purity culture, consuming explicit sexual content can be complicated and fraught. And within systems that push purity culture, desire is seen as shameful and agency is dangerous. But if the heroine is swept away, if she's overwhelmed, if the bond is faded, if he is the pursuer and the initiator, then she isn't morally responsible in the same way. She didn't choose to be bad, she was chosen. And that's an important distinction when you are viewing the world through a framework of purity culture. That kind of structure allows room for deniability. It allows readers to explore explicit erotic content while maintaining an internal identity that is consistent with what the cultures around them are defining as goodness and purity. And that is psychologically understandable. I can understand why someone fully entrenched within purity culture would be drawn to that kind of dynamic in the fantasy that they read, but I also think that that means that the genre as a whole may be functioning in part as a safe container to explore desire that never fully challenges the underlying structures at play. In a way, the most popular romantasy as it is now is a safe outlet for those living within a system of conservative purity culture to explore their erotic desires while staying firmly planted in their cis heteronormative male-dominant comfort zone. Eroticism that is totally contained and acceptable, that frames the woman as the pursued who has no choice but to give in, both because of the literal inability to physically overpower the man in the dynamic, but also especially within dynamics of fated mates. These characters aren't choosing someone based on compatibility or shared values or mutual exploration or just pure desire and attraction. They're literally bound together cosmically, inevitably, often on some level biologically or magically. The universe has decided for them. And that structure aligns very neatly with conservative ideals around destiny and divine pairing. There is only one person for you. You were made for each other. The bond is entirely natural and inevitable and sacred. It reinforces the idea that desire is not something that you consciously create or construct or have any choice in. It's something that happens to you. It's something ordained. If the heroine feels intense attraction and desire, she's not indulging in lust. She's fulfilling her fate. This is just destiny. It also often codes controlling behaviors and possessiveness and jealousy as biological. The male mate doesn't choose to be territorial. He's wired that way. His protectiveness is framed as primal, something, again, that he cannot control, which also removes his agency and his responsibility for his own actions. And when you combine many of these oft-repeated tropes, fated mates, physical asymmetry, sexual dominance and initiation by the male partner, a narrative emphasis on pregnancy as fulfillment, you start to get a very coherent ideological framework. Romantasy has been able to achieve a bit of a magic trick. It creates this eroticism that feels transgressive on the surface, while structurally reinforcing traditional cis heteronormative structures underneath. When the most prominent dominant narratives within the genre follow a template that aligns so neatly with traditional conservative values when it comes to gender and sexuality, reproduction, hierarchy, and power structures, I think it's worth asking why. Not to shame readers or authors, but to try to understand why these elements are the elements that feel safe, that feel comfortable, and why other elements and other tropes and other dynamics feel too disruptive even in a world full of magic and dragons. If the bond is fated, the hierarchy is biological, if dominance in men is instinctive, then patriarchy is not a social construct to interrogate and dismantle. It's simply the way the world works, even in our wildest, most fantastical dreams. And you may be asking, why does any of this matter? And the answer is because these books and us having this discussion right now is not happening in a vacuum. We are living in the real world where real gender sexual dynamics exist. We are also living in a moment where misogyny is having a resurgence in very visible, tangible ways all around the world, where traditional values are being advocated with newfound vigor, where reproductive rights and bodily autonomy are being restricted, especially for cis women and trans people, where strict cis heteronormative gender roles are being reinforced aggressively in political and cultural spaces around the world. And at the same time that all of this is going on, one of the most commercially dominant, successful, money-making genres for women by women is repeatedly romanticizing dynamics that align very neatly with those same very traditional conservative values. The media we consume, the art we consume, both reflects us and shapes us. It mirrors our anxieties, our longings, our internalized beliefs, and it also reinforces for us what feels normal, desirable, and inevitable. Art is political, even when it doesn't intend to be. Honestly, especially when it doesn't intend to be. Propaganda isn't always a coordinated effort. It can simply be the repetition of ideas ad nauseum until they become the norm. It's what we see over and over and over again until it simply feels natural. And that's not to say that these books are evil, harmful, worthless. Not every book has to be revolutionary. Sometimes art reflects the systems that actually exist that we are currently living in without tearing them down. Sometimes we want to consume art that is somewhat familiar even when it is fantasy. But I think we have to move away from the assumption that just because something is marketed for women or to women, that it is automatically invested in women's liberation and equality, because that is not automatically true, even if women are the ones creating it. If anything, like I said at the beginning of this probably very long video, taking women's media seriously and respecting it on its own merit means being willing to actually analyze and examine and interrogate it. To be willing to ask, what is this reinforcing? What is it normalizing? And what is it leaving unquestioned? Reading for fun is fine. Reading romantasy is fine. Fantasizing about things you don't want in real life or do want in real life are fine. But being able to step back and ask, what is this story saying about gender and gender roles and power, about desire, about my own expectations of these things is a skill. And I think it's a valuable one. You can still enjoy a trope. You can still enjoy a book, but you can also allow yourself to notice when the fantasy aligns suspiciously well with real life ideologies. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start seeking out stories that do something a little different, at least here and there. Stories where intimacy is negotiated rather than expected, where power is mutual, where pleasure is prioritized for all parties equally and explicitly, where gender and gender expression are fluid and expansive, and sexuality is too. If you want to dive deeper into how to read more critically, I have a video entirely on that topic that I will link in the cards and in the description box for you to watch next. If you want recommendations for fantasy that is more diverse and explores a wide abundance of experiences and dynamics, I will link my top 10 favorite fantasy books in the description box as well. If you have recommendations for me, either specifically within romantasy or fantasy romance, or just fantasy in general that you think I would enjoy, please, please, please leave your recommendations down below. I would love to have these comments full of recommendations for romantasy that is subverting expectations and common tropes and scripts of this genre. We deserve stories that deliver pleasure that is intentional and respectful, intimacy that is collaborative, and fantasies that don't require one party to shrink themselves in order for it to work. True sexual liberation is knowing your own body, understanding your own desires, and engaging in intimacy that is consensual, collaborative, collaborative and affirming, regardless of your gender and sexuality and that of your partners. And that's why I'm so grateful to have Bellesa as the sponsor of this video. I love that Bellesa promotes empowerment and sexual liberation with their products and services. And Bellesa is giving away free toys and gift cards for toys to everyone who enters the giveaway in my description. So make sure to enter. Thank you again to Bellesa for sponsoring this video. And maybe, just maybe, the real power fantasy is not being chosen by a powerful man, but choosing yourself. Becoming empowered to follow your own path and chase your desires on your own terms. And I would love to see a shift in Romantasy where the most popular titles are the ones championing diversity and expansiveness and sexual liberation in a way that feels truly inclusive and intersectional. Thank you for watching this video and having this discussion with me. I appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you very soon in my next one. Bye, friends.